on environmental history. Before I get to the lecture, I just want to remind you that your first critical review paper is due on Friday. And the assignment itself is relatively self-explanatory. Read the article by William Cronin, summarize the article in about a page, double-spaced, and then provide some sort of comment on the article, a critique. Just tell me what you think of his argument, why it matters to the course, and that's about it. So it's a longish article. It's really interesting. It's a really famous article on environmental history, and I won't go into the details, but today's lecture is kind of in the spirit of William Cronin's argument. Okay, so that's all I'll say about the critical review. If you have any questions, please just let me know. I'm also going to experiment with a different type of PowerPoint presentation. So if you've had a course with me before, my PowerPoint presentations tend to be quite wordy. So I'm trying to limit that just to make them more interesting, so you can focus more on what I'm saying than trying to read the PowerPoint slide. So there'll be less information on the PowerPoint slides than in the past, but hopefully the lectures will still be interesting. All right, well, here we go. So in the chapter, I guess it's chapter 2 of the textbook, Nathan Young argues that there are 3 problems humans face in relation to the natural environment. There's the problem of abundance, diminishing returns, and time. Okay. Now, I don't think this is right, and I think it's ironic because the chapter is supposed to be on environmental history, and he doesn't really do environmental history in that chapter. So he's making a claim that if we study the past and past human settlements or city-states or whole empires, they often have these 3 problems. So he talks about Mesopotamia, for instance, of having an abundance of fertile land, population grew, eventually, the land use expanded, and one of the unintended consequences of kind of an expanding farmland is the canal system they created, which inadvertently created the salination problem with some of the land, which made it infertile, and then he says Mesopotamia collapsed because of that. That's not really what happened. It's part of the story, and it is true that if we look at other city-states and empires around the world, from the Yangtze River in China, if we look at the Aztec Empire, the Mayan Empire, that story does kind of recur. But one of the problems with that story is you have to just kind of select out cases that support the evidence. And there's probably many more cases that don't support the evidence, which is what I mean. What I mean is that, saying there's 3 problems that humans face in relation to the natural environment, abundance, diminishing returns, and time, he's making a claim that all 3 things always occur, which is just historically inaccurate. These 3 things often occur, and they do occur, and we can explain how some societies collapsed because of their relation to the natural environment. But there's lots of other societies that didn't collapse with them. And so I guess my point is that there's not enough evidence in the historical record to say that these are the 3 main problems that humans face in relation to the natural environment in support of their societies. What usually just happens is societies change. And sometimes that change is fast, such as a revolution or an economic collapse that forces change. Some change is slow, which means that societies over time just become unlike themselves. They change into something else. So if we even look at Mesopotamia, there's a counter argument that Mesopotamia did not collapse because of poor land use. So there's a book called Against the Grain by John Scott. He's a political scientist at Yale. And he plays an interesting thought experiment. He says, well, why would someone want to live in a city state? Why would someone want to live in Mesopotamia at the time? So, the archaeological record shows that as humans started to increase their agricultural output, our villages grew. We developed the first city-state in Mesopotamia, and the archaeological record shows that we became unhealthy. So we became shorter. We had more disease. We were in closer proximity to other humans and to animals, which increased the rate of infections. So people living in Mesopotamia had unhealthier lives than people around Mesopotamia who were still hunting and gathering and doing small scale farming. So John Scott says, okay, well, why would someone want to be in the state? Why would someone want to work on a farm and give part of the proceeds to a king, and get taxed and get punished and be part of a lower class system? It'd be better for everyone just to be hunter-gatherers, and everyone would have known that, because you'd be able to see that there's these healthy people outside of the city, and then unhealthy people in the city. Outside of the city, people are free. Inside the city, people are enslaved. Right? So John Scott says that Mesopotamia probably collapsed, in part, yes, because of their land use problems. But as the state got weak because the land became less fertile, people just walked away. People avoided the state. The state didn't have the resources to keep people within the city anymore. So the state weakened. So this is, it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think John Scott's work, he shows how this plays out in Southeast Asia and in South America as well, where people had to be forced to be state members. And a lot of people would just walk away. It was really hard to keep your population because people wanted to be free. Now, if we look at this idea of abundance again, we don't always suffer from abundance. So his argument is that if something is abundant, we don't respect it. It has less value. So it's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis. So if there's a lot of a resource that you want, well, then it's valued less, or you're more likely to waste it. And over time, if it's not a renewable resource, it just disappears. So think of fossil fuels and stuff like that. But if you look at history, there are societies, there are cultures, there are people, and there are individuals who don't abuse abundance. People, if your culture respects the natural environment, and this is just hypothetical, you're not going to overuse it. If you have a high level of scientific information about ecosystems, your scientists will warn you when you are about to destroy that ecosystem. Okay. So I won't go into diminishing returns in time. You can read about that in the chapter. Another critique, I guess, I'd have of this is if you look at, say, the Aztec Empire. Well, it collapsed not because the Aztecs had poor land use. They had great land use. They collapsed because of the Spanish imperialism. So Cortez came and killed the emperor and slaughtered many of the Aztecs and basically destroyed the economy because the Spanish wanted Aztec gold. So what's more interesting, I think, from an environmental historical point of view, is to just ask the question, in relation, say, to the Aztec Empire in Central America, what impact did the Aztec Empire have on the land? I mean, they had extensive gold mines, they had farmed, they built canals just like the Mesopotamians did. They cleared, miles and miles and miles of jungle. So to really understand from the Aztec Empire from the point of view of environmental history, you'd want to explore how the Aztec Empire maintained its road system and its trade routes, how it distributed maize, corn, um, and how it managed the the property, how it managed its cities, how it managed the mines. What did they do with the tailings from the mine? So that's what's left over after you've extracted the gold. Uh, you can compare how the Aztec Empire mined versus there's ancient mines in Germany, for instance, where people were mining for gold. Did they use similar technologies? What was the ecological consequences of Aztec gold mining? How did that compare to ancient German and Gaelic gold mines, for instance? So again, this is, it's a critique of Nathan's chapter because I don't think he's doing environmental history in that chapter. He kind of claims to be. But I think he's asking more sociological questions in relation to history. So he's doing more sociological history than he is environmental history, or yeah, environmental history. So environmental history is simply, you know, about telling stories of humans in relation to the natural environment. Okay. And as you'll see when you read the William Cronin piece, he's arguing that our idea of wilderness has to include a recognition that the natural world is socially constructed in our imaginations, and that we interact with it just according to our cultural mores. So to understand, say, the Aztec Empire or the Mesopotamian Empire from the view of environmental history, you would want to know, what was the Aztecs' view of nature? Did they see nature as a sacred place? Did they see nature as this evil thing that needed to be destroyed and cleared by clearing jungles and stuff? We don't know, right? So I guess my larger point here is that our relationship to the natural world doesn't follow what Jung states. Societies, cultures, individuals have various experiences in relation to the natural environment. Some societies, some individuals have large impacts on the natural environment, and some have little. Moreover, these things change over time. So you can't just say that the Roman Empire had a huge carbon footprint, because that's not true. It varied, right? Hopefully that makes some sense. Now, another critique of the chapter is kind of this, he doesn't say this explicitly, but there's an assumption, and this is not just him, I think I've seen this all forever, where people, when they talk about environmental issues, they like to talk about indigenous folks as well. And there's this assumption that some people make that indigenous peoples either live in harmony with nature, or had lived in harmony with nature, or had a cultural view that incorporated a love of nature. It's like, none of this is true. It's like, and it's not true because there is no single indigenous culture. If we look just at North America, there are thousands and thousands of indigenous cultures with different histories. And those histories include interactions with nature. Those histories include interactions with other groups. So, and again, this is kind of a lesson from environmental history, is that we should avoid any sort of belief that there's one indigenous culture and that all indigenous people live in harmony with nature, or believe in the spirituality of nature. And just stick to the facts, which means that if you want to make a claim about indigenous peoples, you have to say, well, which indigenous people? So if we look at the history of indigenous folks in North America, with thousands of different groups, cultural groups, and subcultural groups as well. So if you look at the Lakota Sioux, for instance, there's various kind of ethnic groups within the Lakota that had slightly different cultural beliefs. So if you want to ask the question like Nathan Young was asking, how do humans interact with the natural environment, and what are the limits placed on us through the natural world? Well, different indigenous groups have different relationships to nature, different cultural beliefs in nature. Not all indigenous groups, you know, lived in harmony with nature. So if you some overexploited natural resources. Okay, so you have to look at each specific group and ask questions about their particular views of nature and what they actually did in nature, right? So if we look at the Lakota Sioux, for instance, they were extremely wasteful of bison. So bison are fairly easy to kill. And they would have buffalo jumps. So in this slide here, this is actually a sculpture. It's a beautiful sculpture of a buffalo jump. So the Lakota would basically just herd bison off cliffs and into gullies where they just roll down and die. And then they would just use like they just take the choice cuts of meat, organ meat, and usually the brains. So they want the fatty, high caloric parts of the bison. They take some of the fur, but not all of it. Some of the hide, but not all of it, because they had just so many bison. So this is kind of in support of Nathan Young's claim that some people, when faced, or some groups, when faced with abundance, have a tendency to overuse it because the value of that resource is perceived to be low because there's so much, right? So the Lakota were extremely wasteful. Now, interestingly enough, in this slide or this architect or this sculpture, the Lakota is on horseback. So, a good environmental historian would then recognize that, oh, so this particular style of buffalo jump is a post-contact one. So what happened is when Cortez invaded Central America and Mexico, I think it was Cortez. Well, basically when the Spanish came to what is now Mexico, they brought horses. Some of the horses got away. Some of those horses started to migrate through the Southwest and into the plains of the Great Plains of the U.S. And Native peoples, found the horses, learned to ride them, started to breed them, and horses became a huge currency. Horses had been in North America prior to the peopling of the continent, so which I'll talk about later. But so prior to indigenous folks' entry into the Americas through the land bridge from Siberia, there were horses in North America, but they went extinct for some reason. There's some speculation, I think I got this right, but there's some belief that horses actually left the Americas through the land bridge and into Asia, where they thrived, and then people started to domesticate them. So they came back through the Spanish conquest. And this fundamentally changed, actually, many indigenous groups' relationship to the land, because they became more efficient hunters. So the Lakota were able to probably hunt more bison with a horse than what they would do previously. So previously they would sneak up on bison on foot, a bunch of Lakota hunters, and would just scared them into gullies and off cliffs and stuff. Okay, but that's more dangerous, obviously. So my point here is that, if we look at indigenous groups, and we have to pay attention to this myth of indigenous harmony, that the Lakota they were not great stewards of the buffalo population. Okay, and now the buffalo were spiritually important to and are spiritually important to the Lakota, but pre-Columbian Lakota had varying relationships to the bison. So the Lakota slowly moved westward. So they kind of originate in what's now Ohio. I believe they came out of the early woodlands culture. And as they migrated westward into the plains, in part because of conflict and battles with other indigenous groups, in part because their hunting grounds, there's lots of competition with other bands and other groups for hunting. So the Lakota, who were fairly weak early in their history in terms of numbers, they basically were chased westward, where they found buffalo. and their culture changed as they started to interact with those buffalo. Or bison is another way to say buffalo. Um, but my point here again is that the Lakota were not great stewards, but they didn't have to be, right? There's so many buffalo on the Great Plains that there's just no need to be a great steward. Now, what's also interesting is that the nature of the Great Plains itself, so grasslands, was kept grasslands because there were so many buffalo. I think Nathan Young writes about this in the chapter. So that's really interesting. That had there not been buffalo, there would have been more woodland in the plains. Just buffalo graze, and so any sort of plant or tree that starts to grow a sapling would not survive, and they would get trampled by all these millions and millions and millions of buffalo. Anyway, now if we want to compare the Lakota, who were essentially hunter-gatherers, well, around the same time, there was another group, the Mississippi, who lived in a massive city in what is now southern Illinois, of about 18,000 people. So this is a pre-Columbian city in North America called Cahokia. Well, obviously, the Mississippi had greater impact on the natural environment. They had a different relationship to the natural environment because of population density, right? So if you look online, you'll see that this is just an artist's recreation of what Cahokia would have looked like. But the mounds, these mounds still exist. They're quite huge. You'll notice that they're pyramid shaped. Now, the reason why they're pyramid shaped, and this is just neither here nor there, but it's interesting, is if you don't have modern technology, the only way to make a big structure is to have a pyramid shape, because the way it's basically stable. So once you have, it's called an angle of repose. Once you have the right angle of repose, you can get the right height, and the structure itself will be quite strong and long lasting, as we'll see from and this is why the Mayan and the Aztec and the Olmec and the Egyptians all use pyramids. So there's nothing magical about a pyramid. It's just good architecture. So the Mississippi had a huge city of 18,000 people and massive trade routes from the Gulf Coast to Ontario, to the East Coast. So they traded a lot with other indigenous groups. It was a thriving community. They traded corn, lapis, rock. But they also, because of the large population, they had huge farms. And a similar thing did happen in Cahokia as what happened in Mesopotamia, where they had to build a canal system to divert water from the Mississippi River to irrigate their fields. But as they did that, they inadvertently created higher salination in the soil, which made it somewhat infertile. And that could have caused the population, the society, to collapse. Okay, so again, that's in support of Nathan Young's assertion. But we would want to know, what were the environmental, or what were the spiritual views of the Mississippi in relation to the natural world, especially as they went from hunter-gatherers to a city-state. How did that change their relationship to nature? Now, obviously, they had a more sophisticated interaction with nature in terms of their ability to farm. The Lakota had very, very small scale farming because they were more migratory. They didn't invest in huge farms, right? They didn't need them. But the Mississippi had a pretty extensive farming system. Okay, so that would change how they view the natural world, and but that would be for an environmental historian to dig up and to figure that out. So my point here is that oftentimes people make unfounded assumptions about indigenous people's relationships to nature and lump all indigenous groups together. Um, and that's not accurate. It's best to look at different groups and how they change over time. Now, what is also interesting, if we'll go back to the Aztec Empire for a minute. So if we look at the Aztec, after the Aztec Empire collapsed, well, the people didn't disappear, even though the Spanish killed lots of people. What actually happened is the people who used to live within the Aztec Empire either dispersed into the jungle or just maintained smaller villages that were independent. There's no longer an empire. So if you look at Central America right now, there are a number of hunter-gatherer groups in the jungles. And people always assume that, oh, these people have never been civilized. These people have always been hunter-gatherers. They're holdovers from history. That's not true. And these are not. So the assumption here is that indigenous people living in the jungle in Central America have always been there. They're part of the natural landscape. They are closer to nature than anyone else. They're actually refugees from the Aztec Empire. They've only been there for maybe 400 years. So almost all indigenous groups in Central America are not holdovers in history. They actually have just different and new relationships to nature. So after the fall of the Aztec Empire, some groups just went into the jungle to avoid the Spanish because the Spanish were killing everyone. And over time, they just developed into a hunter-gatherer culture. Okay, so whereas 300 to 400 years earlier, they had a high impact on nature because of the huge construction projects of the Aztecs and extensive mining and farming and canal building. Over time, those same people had a lower impact on nature and different relationship to nature. So, and that really is my main point here, is that to do environmental history correctly, you have to be specific. So when you talk about indigenous groups, you want to say which indigenous groups, what is their history, what are their particular views, how do their views change over time, how do their views impact their relationship to nature. So people shouldn't just say, indigenous folks are better stewards of the land and they've always been like that. It's like, no, all human cultures change over time. And as populations increase, the need for resources increases. This does definitely put a strain on this relationship to nature. So to me, the main lesson from environmental history is that our relationships with the natural environment change over time. We don't necessarily become more exploitative of the natural environment. Sometimes we become less. Okay, and it's just a matter of finding out the evidence. So this is why I don't like when scholars suggest these general statements that all societies are affected by the same three things. It's like, oh, that's just not true. Our relationships to nature change quite a bit. If we look at the Anasazi, so the Anasazi they were a group in the American Southwest. They're not necessarily extinct now, but their culture changed into something else. So after the collapse of the Anasazi Pueblos Society, the Anasazi, I think in the Fremont, kind of started to interact more, and their culture just changed over time. But the Anasazi, would have a very different relationship to nature because the American Southwest is desert. It's a very difficult place to live, but you can grow corn, and there's abundance of wildlife for hunting. So even though the climate is extreme, it's suitable for high populations. And the Anasazi built pueblos, towns, and yeah, and I think Nathan Young talks about the Anasazi in the textbook, so I won't go too deeply or any deeper into that. Right. Sorry, I was just trying to think. All right, so environmental history is not environmental sociology, but I think it's completely fascinating and it's interesting because we can learn a lot about our society by exploring what are usually unintended consequences of our interactions in nature or unintended consequences of our manipulations in nature, right? So I'm going to tell you a story about moose, deer, and caribou in Nova Scotia. Okay, it's just an environmental history that's interesting because our current situation is the result of past decisions and past politics, and even war. So if you want to understand the natural environment today in Nova Scotia, you have to understand Nova Scotia's environmental history. Okay? Um, so deer today in Nova Scotia are quite ubiquitous. There's lots and lots of deer, but deer they're not an invasive species, but they're not naturally from here. Okay, so there would have been some deer in Nova Scotia prior to colonialism, but there weren't many. And I think the research shows that probably by the time the colonists started to settle here, there were no deer. There were tons of moose, and there's a particular type of moose from this area called the taiga moose, and there were tons and tons of caribou. So prior to colonialism, the Mi'kmaq hunted moose and caribou, but there were so many, and the Mi'kmaq are great hunters. And there's a really interesting book, it's just an aside, by Campbell Harding. Yeah, he was a British military guy in the 17th century, 18th century in Halifax, and he wrote a book called Sporting Life in Acadie, where it's just basically all is hunting and fishing exploits. And he always had Mi'kmaq guides on his hunts and his fishing, and he goes on and on and on about how absolutely incredible his Mi'kmaq guides were in terms of their outdoorsmanship and their hunting and their ability to fish. But anyway, the point here is that prior to European colonialism, Nova Scotia had tons of moose and tons of caribou. Now, what happened was as the colonists started to settle here, the wealthy sport hunters brought deer to Nova Scotia because they're easier to hunt. So moose are dangerous to hunt. So moose kill more people than bears in Canada. And caribou, I'm not sure why honestly the rich sport hunters in Nova Scotia at the time didn't want to shoot the caribou. They did hunt them, but anyway, the point is they brought the deer population. They brought deer to Nova Scotia because they wanted to hunt them. And as this happened, the moose population started to decline. Now, there's lots of reasons for the moose population decline. But one was the colonial government basically incentivized the Mi'kmaq to hunt moose for sale, for market, as opposed to use, and supplied the Mi'kmaq with rifles. But it wasn't just the Mi'kmaq who were shooting moose. There were other. So moose was a popular meat for the colonists. And the Mi'kmaq, whose lives were being disrupted by colonialism, need to make a living. So there started to be a meat market hunt for moose, which started to put pressure on the population because the Mi'kmaq, prior to colonialism, didn't have there's just not enough people here to kill a lot of moose. There's lots of other fish and stuff too. There's tons of fish at the time. But with colonialism, we see more pressure on the moose population through hunting. But what also happened is the deer passed on a virus to the moose called moose sickness. So basically what happens is when deer are browsing, when they're eating, they inadvertently eat a snail, and the snail carries this virus that doesn't hurt the deer. It just goes through their digestive tract. So what happens is, the deer poop all over the forest, and moose are browsing in the same forest, and they inadvertently eat a little bit of poop. they get the virus, and then they get horribly sick and dizzy, and then they die. So today, the mainland moose population of taiga moose is probably only I don't even think there's 100 left. So whereas before the taiga moose in mainland Nova Scotia was quite large, now it's listed as a species at risk. It's an endangered species, or it's going to be extirpated from Nova Scotia. So it's a highly protected moose now, which I'll talk about in a second. The caribou population was overhunted and is now extirpated. So I think by the 1940s, that was the last time there was caribou in Nova Scotia. Okay, so the point here is that the colonists, they didn't try to kill the moose population. They didn't try to replace the moose population with deer. It was an unintended consequence of some wealthy sport hunters wanting to hunt deer like they would have hunted at home in England. So they brought deer here. They had no idea that, what this moose sickness. And I don't think it was really discovered what exactly was happening to the moose until the 1960s. That's when moose sickness was kind of discovered. The biologists knew that the moose were getting sick and the number was affecting the reproduction rate, but they didn't know exactly why. I think it was the 1960s. Now, World War I also had a consequence for the moose and caribou populations, just because of the war. The moose and caribou population was hunted to can meat to send over to Europe. So that I don't think the caribou population really recovered from that, and the moose population, that certainly didn't help. Now, the only place in Nova Scotia where the moose population is healthy, it's actually overly abundant, is Cape Breton, right? So in Cape Breton, you have, especially in the Highlands, you have a ton of moose, so much so that there's, organized moose culls, which I think the Mi'kmaq usually participate in. So you basically have to reduce the population of moose because they're overpopulated. There's not enough natural predators, right? Because there's no wolves. Normally, a wolf would be the main, and black bear are the main predators to moose. So they usually kill young moose, not the big ones, because the big ones will just stomp on them. But anyway, so Cape Breton has this healthy moose population. So what's interesting there from an environmental historical point of view is that moose population is not the taiga moose, is the northwestern moose. And they were seeded there from a population in Ontario. So the moose that is most populous now in Nova Scotia is actually from Ontario. The biologists brought them by train, I believe, to Cape Breton, where they thrive now. Okay. I'm not sure if that particular population is more resilient in relation to moose sickness, but what's interesting from an environmental historical point of view is that if you are a Mi'kmaq hunter and you are hunting a moose that you wouldn't have seen 300 years ago, right? So if you're a Mi'kmaq hunter in Cape Breton, you would have hunted the taiga moose 300 years ago. If you're a Mi'kmaq hunter in Cape Breton today, you're hunting a whole other species, or subspecies, basically. So it's just interesting that in our relationship to nature as it changes, as we introduce populations to new areas, you're interacting in a different way, in this case with moose. Now, moose arrived in North America they trickled in from Siberia. So, the Beringian land bridge, which was exposed for, probably tens of thousands of years, worked both ways. So horses went from North America into Asia through Siberia. Moose came from the boreal forests of Siberia into North America over tens of thousands of years, and then they slowly disperse. So moose have a northernmost limit and a southernmost limit. So they can't go too far south because it's too hot, and moose really don't like hot weather. And they have a northern limit because moose feel safest in boreal forests. So if they're too exposed, like in the Arctic tundra, they don't feel good, so they don't migrate there. Now, so moose, basically are largely in the boreal forests of North America, but they're all over the place. They're all the way south to Colorado. Utah has moose now. But what's interesting is that because of human encroachment, the last 150 years has seen the largest redistribution of the moose population. So the moose are basically trying to avoid humans. So they're moving into places where they've never been before, or they haven't been for thousands of years. So moose migrate when they face a shortage of food. Well, humans cause a shortage of food by deforestation. Moose will migrate when they face unbearable predation. So if, for instance, if there's an increase in the black bear population, the young moose are more likely to get attacked. They're more likely to the moose are likely to leave. They'll leave the areas where there's lots of bear. Same thing with maybe coyotes to some extent, but definitely wolves. So moose will migrate away from places that have high predation, including human predation. So the last 150 years has seen moose move into new areas in North America. So again, the point here is that if we want to tell the environmental history of moose, we have to recognize that history involves human history, and it's not us chasing moose around. They're just reacting to our societies, right? Now, the final thing I'll say here is that the mainland moose population, so the mainland taiga moose population in Nova Scotia, it is listed as a species at risk, which means it's heavily managed. And not only are they managed as a population, the wilderness areas where they find themselves are also managed and protected. So it means that the moose of today in Nova Scotia are experiencing a nature that is a managed nature through bureaucratic processes. So there's limits on hunting. There's no hunting of the taiga moose. There's limits to forestry, road creation in areas where there are taiga moose. There's attempts to create ecosystems that the taiga moose will benefit from and grow their population in, hopefully. So the moose are experiencing a nature themselves that is a nature that is managed by humans. Whereas 500-600 years ago, the moose would have experienced a completely random nature, right? So this is, again, just a part of environmental history, is to say, well, animals experience a world in which we are part of that experience, but we also kind of curate a wilderness or a nature that has an impact on other beings. Okay? And a good environmental history should be one that tells a story of how these things work together, how nature affects humans and how humans affects nature. So anyway, hope this was interesting for you, and I will have another lecture for you on Monday. All right, have a good week, everyone.